It took me about 40 years to realize there was a piece missing in the success formula we're all handed. And when it finally clicked, a lot of things in my life that had never quite added up before suddenly made sense. Things I had blamed on myself, decisions that looked sensible at the time, achievements that didn't feel quite as satisfying as advertised. Most of us grow up hearing the same basic formula for a meaningful life: work hard, make good decisions, build a career, reach the milestones. And if you do all those things well, life is supposed to feel fulfilling. That's the framework most of us are handed. And to be fair, it does work for some people. But what that framework quietly assumes is something we don't talk about very often. It assumes that everyone starts life on stable ground: a stable childhood, a stable nervous system, support when big decisions have to be made, and a sense that if things go wrong, someone will be able to help you steady yourself again. But when life includes things like trauma, instability, complicated family dynamics, or long stretches where survival became the main priority, the path doesn't unfold the same way. Sometimes opportunities disappear before you can take them. Sometimes the sensible choice becomes the safer one, even when it isn't your dream. Sometimes the decisions you make aren't really about ambition at all. They're about keeping the ground from shifting underneath your feet. And sometimes survival quietly becomes the main work for a while. Looking back at my own life, I can see that dynamic pretty clearly. I followed a lot of those sensible paths. I made decisions meant to keep the peace. I chose stability over risk more than once. From the outside, my life probably looked pretty competent, and some of it was, but if I'm being honest, it was more likely hypervigilance dressed up in a power suit and sensible heels. Performatively, I was doing the right things, while at the same time never feeling quite like I was doing anything right. Of course, like we do, I assumed the problem was me. I thought maybe I just hadn't worked hard enough, or chosen well enough, or achieved enough. Because when the results of your life don't quite match the story you were told about success, the easiest conclusion is that you must be doing something wrong. So you try harder, you adjust, you recalibrate, you collect more skills, more credentials, more ways to prove that you're doing things correctly. And for a while, that strategy seemed perfectly reasonable. If success comes from making the right choices and building the right skills, then the logical thing to do is keep improving the resume. Eventually, the pieces would fall into place. At least that was the theory. So of course I decided I needed one more certification to add to that list. But first, let me tell you how I got there. After my years in government, and after a season of being a very full-time mommy, I started a small business consulting practice called Efficiency Factor. My role was to help small business owners work on their businesses instead of in them. We developed systems, processes, structures that would make their work more efficient and more sustainable. And on paper, it worked beautifully, but there was a cycle I couldn't ignore. I would set someone up with a clear system that should have made their work easier, and somehow they would still end up right back in the same cycle they were trying to escape. Missed opportunities, last-minute chaos, self-sabotage that didn't make any sense on the surface. At first, I assumed it was just their resistance to change. But after watching this happen over and over again with different people, something became obvious. A lot of these incredibly capable business owners didn't need better systems. They were getting tangled up in habits that no amount of efficiency or strategy could fix, because they kept stepping on the same rake again and again and again. And if I'm being really honest here, that wasn't entirely unfamiliar to me either. Years later, when I trained as a life coach, I thought finally I would have the tools to help people navigate those kinds of patterns. But during the training, something interesting kept happening. Anytime someone would mention trauma, either in their own story or in a client's story, the instructors would immediately shut the conversation down and refer the person to therapy. Which makes sense, because life coaching, after all, is not designed to treat or diagnose trauma. But that also kind of raised an uncomfortable question for me, because if people keep stepping on the same rake, it turns out that strategy alone isn't going to be enough. At some point, as life coaches, we have to point to those rakes and acknowledge what keeps happening so that our clients can begin to recognize those patterns within themselves. So I enrolled in a program to add a trauma-informed practitioner certification to my life coaching. And that's where something unexpected happened. Instead of simply adding one more credential to my resume, I started recognizing my own life inside the material. Patterns that had never made sense before suddenly did. Decisions that I had judged myself for began to look different. The constant effort to get things right started to look less like ambition and more like a nervous system trying to create safety. And that was the moment the realization really landed. The frameworks I had been measuring myself against assumed a stable foundation. A lot of my life, however, had been built on terrain that was anything but stable. When the ground is uneven, the path doesn't unfold the same way. Progress can take longer. Some opportunities never even materialize. Some chapters take years to recover from. And some of the milestones people expect simply aren't part of their story. Sometimes milestones land on your resume, but they never quite land in your nervous system. And sometimes the real work for certain chapters is simply surviving and rebuilding. And that's when the focus of both my healing and my work started to change. Achievement stopped being the center of the story. Instead, the nervous system did. Because once I understood how trauma shapes perception, decision-making, and our sense of safety in the world, a lot of my past started to make sense. The constant effort, the hypervigilance, the feeling that I had to get everything exactly right. It wasn't a character flaw. It was a nervous system trying to create safety. And that realization quietly reorganized everything. And now it's nervous system first, then decisions, and then everything else. Once you start seeing life through that lens, the questions you ask begin to change. The old framework was always asking, what should I achieve next? But the nervous system asks a different question entirely. And that realization is part of what led me to here, to a decision that, at least on the surface, might seem a little unusual. Because next month, Ralph and I are moving to France, not as an escape plan, and not as some dramatic reinvention, but as an alignment decision. And in a slightly ironic twist, it also circles back to a choice I made almost exactly 40 years ago when I turned down the chance for a year of French study in Provence, because the sensible thing at the time was to accept a promotion instead. Back then, safety meant choosing the responsible path. Now safety looks a little different. A chance to build a life that feels a little slower, a little safer, a little more humane. Not perfect, just a life my nervous system can breathe in. And if the framework you were handed for success never quite worked for your life, you may not have failed the framework. The framework might simply not have been built for the terrain you were on, because life doesn't always start on stable ground. And sometimes the real work of adulthood is learning how to build stability where there wasn't any before. So if parts of your life haven't unfolded the way the brochure promised, you're not necessarily doing it wrong. You might just be navigating different terrain. And sometimes the next step isn't a bigger achievement. Sometimes it's just one step that feels safe enough to take, one regulated step. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, you're welcome to share what part of the life as advertised framework never quite fit your experience. And if you'd rather just sit with that idea for a while, that counts too. Ralph, of course, believes the correct response to most philosophical questions is a walk, followed by a snack. And to be honest, he's not wrong there either.